In this video, we're looking at the only NVIDIA GPU that is not getting absolutely scalped right now, the RTX 4060, up against, well, what if you wanted more VRAM, because it only has 8? Well, you've got the 7600 XT from AMD, and we're going to be looking at a ton of benchmarks to show things like, VRAM capacity going out of control, but what if we just adjusted the settings down? What does that mean? And what if I don't care about ray tracing? Well, games like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle require ray tracing, so will Doom the Dark Ages. This is starting to be a thing that I think it's getting harder to ignore, even at the lower end stuff. So we've got massive amount of benchmarks here. I think I ran about 70. We've got it sorted for no ray tracing, for only ray tracing, and it's not as simple as you might think, because ray tracing requires some VRAM. And what are these GPUs priced right now anyway? Well, again, remember that the 50 series just launched, but only the high end, and they're being scalped. Like 5080s are at $2,000. That's not why we're looking at in today's video, what if I want something that isn't being scalped? Well, we got to go down to the 4060. That's about $300 right now, which is its MSRP. But it only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So if I wanted something with more VRAM, I've got to go with the 7600 XT from AMD right now for 16 gigabytes at about $330 though, which means that in this case, you're actually spending more money on the AMD GPU for similar performance, about 12% more money. And on the average of all of my benchmarks here, the 7600 XT is only about 2% faster, meaning these are about tied. However, look at the wide ranges of advantages here. The plus direction is advantage 7600 XT. The minus direction is advantage 4060. And you can see wide varieties of huge wins in either direction. Again, that kind of depends on where we at with VRAM capacity, just certain games favoring one brand or the other. But then also ray tracing on versus off. And again, there are some games now where you can't turn ray tracing off. So if you want to play them, you have to accept that as a real situation that you're going to have to deal with. So let's go ahead and do a massive number of side-by-sides, because another thing that gets hidden by big benchmark graphs is what if some of these have upscaling enabled? Because realistically, on this powerful of hardware, on big AAA games, you might need to be using upscaling, especially if you're trying to play on a 1440p display. Well, if I just pretend like they're the same thing and put them in a bar graph like this, you miss some of the distinctions on the image quality differences between DLSS and FSR. Well, DLSS has a real advantage in image quality. But again, having more VRAM, also a real advantage. Let's jump into the side-by-sides, and there's a lot of them. Bear with me. Here we have the 7600 XT able to run a ray tracing always-on game, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, perfectly fine. 57 FPS in this demanding jungle scene. Oh, tons of foliage, hard to run here, but it's doing fine. Whereas the 4060 has its frame time graph going absolutely nuts here. It gets worse the longer you play the game. I think it eventually crashes if I let the benchmark run long enough here. And that's a bit of a problem, right? So here we're seeing the 1% lows is 3 times better on the 7600 XT, and the average is 46% better. So even though this is a ray tracing title, the additional VRAM is helping the 7600 XT give good performance where this 4060 can't. However, what if you went down to medium graphics settings? Because that's what complicates the VRAM difference when trying to decide the value on this. Because if you're willing to adjust settings to stay within the VRAM buffer, then the VRAM buffer isn't a problem. And now the NVIDIA ray tracing advantage is showing its advantage against the 7600 XT, where it's 21% faster in the averages, 19% faster in the 1% lows. And both GPUs are honestly giving you a pretty good experience. Here we're at 88 FPS versus 73. And what makes this even more complicated is with, well, for side-by-side benchmarks, I like to stick to graphical presets. I think it's important to note that oftentimes all you need to do on an 8 gigabyte GPU is lower the textures. In this case, the texture cache. So this is now the Ultra preset, but with the textures and shadows set to medium. And you can see that the 4060 is now averaging kind of in the mid 80 FPS range as we go through here. So realistically, the issue with 8 gigabytes of VRAM on the 4060 comes down more to just you'll have to be more mindful of the settings that you use. Now, if we try up to go to 1440p Ultra settings, the 7600 XT can run it, but not particularly well. We're averaging 42 FPS, whereas the 4060 is just absolutely crashed here. It's dead. It cannot handle this because it's just way too far beyond the 8 gigabyte VRAM capacity. So let's skip ahead and try what if we used resolution scaling. Now, this is a game that doesn't have FSR, but it does have a TAA-based resolution scaler. If I set it to 66%, which is what would be called the quality setting, now the 7600 XT is going to about 52 FPS here. It's okay, it's not great. So now what if we turn down to medium settings, because even though 7600 XT had enough VRAM for the higher settings, it really didn't have the performance. Well, now it's at 51 FPS, but the 4060 went from broken to now averaging 61 FPS here and 20% faster than the 7600 XT, although they have similar 1% lows, which indicates that maybe the 4060 is still having a little bit of VRAM-related hiccups there. And I'm curious how much a longer play session would end up giving you additional problems. So what if we used the medium settings and then used upscaling? Well, here we have DLSS on the left-hand side, I think looking a lot sharper than the TAA-based upscaler, although they're set to the same internal rendering resolution of 66% per axis. Here we're seeing a 25% advantage for the 4060 in performance, 84 versus 67, but I think, again, overall you're getting better image quality out of it due to the better upscaler of DLSS versus just the TAA-based upscaler there. But not only, ray tracing games aren't the only games that have some performance issues on 8GB cards. Final Fantasy XVI at 1080p Ultra. Look at the 1% lows and the frame time graph on the left-hand side of the screen with the 4060, getting these big spikes in that frame time graph because it's having to stutter as it shifts out textures and loads them back in, giving double the 1% low performance for the 7600 XT. Averages are only a 19% advantage, but honestly, neither of them was averaging 60 FPS. So what if we go down to medium settings? Well, believe it or not here, if you look at the 1% lows in the frame time graph, it's still looking like the 4060 is choking on its 8GB of VRAM. Notice that while the averages are 68 versus 56, so 21% advantage for the 7600 XT, the 1% lows are a 67% advantage for the 7600 XT, and that frame time graph looks way smoother. Those are noticeable spiky stutters on the 4060. If we go all the way down to the low settings, it looks like we're no longer choking on VRAM issues, and the 7600 XT is still 24% faster, but we're now no longer seeing the big advantage in the 1% lows that we were seeing before, and the frame time graph on the 4060 looks a lot smoother. So again, that VRAM issue is a real thing in a lot of games, even sometimes without the RT. Now at 1440p Ultra with DLSS and FSR quality, you can see, actually let me go back and run through that a little bit more here. You can see that the 4060 is absolutely choking on VRAM. It's down below 30 FPS much of the time. It averages 35 here. The frame time graph is super spiky. And again, this is even trying to use upscaling to handle it. The 7600 XT is playable here at 49 FPS, but I still don't think these are really the settings I would use on either GPU, to be honest. But again, the card with more than 8GB of VRAM is having a much better time. At 1440p medium settings, we're no longer seeing as much of a crazy issue on the frame time graphs, although overall performance isn't amazing either way. We're seeing 46 versus 39. Notice that we're back to native resolution now, though, instead of using upscaling like we did for the Ultra settings. If we kick on upscaling with the medium settings, our performance numbers are now fairly good, 67 versus 58, but I will say that I think DLSS looks a bit better here, FSR looking a little more grainy around the edges of the character in motion. At 1440p low settings, it's still not great performance at native resolution, 47 versus 39. So this is where I'm saying that, like, I really don't think that you can avoid upscaling if you're playing the latest AAA games on a 7600 XT. So if you're like, I just don't care about the image quality advantage for DLSS because I'll never use it. Well, I mean, it depends on the kind of games you play. But in a lot of games, if you want to play around 60 FPS, notice you have to kick on DLSS and FSR quality here, which again, let's look at this then. Because there is definitely some image quality differences on that, and anyway, just something to keep in mind. Let's go ahead and jump into an Unreal Engine 5 game. This is Silent Hill 2, and if we try to just max everything out at 1080p, epic settings with hardware accelerated ray tracing turned on, the 4060 has a big advantage at 48%, but I'm not sure these are really the settings I'd use. 40 FPS average still isn't amazing, even though it's a lot better than 27. So again, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, there's a big advantage here, but are these the settings you would use? If we turn off hardware accelerated ray tracing and just go with the 1080p epic settings, notice the 4060 gains a little performance, but the 7600 XT gains a lot compared to where it was before. Now we're at 43 versus 40, and the 4060 only has an 8% lead, although it still does have the advantage here. Now, if we drop down to medium settings and no hardware ray tracing, we're now closer to a 60 FPS average at 57 versus 54, and it's a 6% lead for the 4060. If we go all the way down to low settings, we now have a pretty high refresh rate experience at 83 versus 80. Honestly, this is a slow enough paced game. I'd probably have stuck to those medium settings myself, though. Now, what if we want to play on a 1440p display? Now we've got to go to epic settings, ray tracing on, DLSS and FSR quality, and we're at 42 versus 28, so 50% advantage for the 4060, but overall frame rates aren't that good. If we turn off hardware RT, the 4060 gains a little performance, but the 7600 XT closes a bunch of the gap, although it's still an 18% advantage for the 4060 at 46 versus 39. Again, though, still not the most amazing overall frame rates. So what if we go down to 1440p medium settings and try to play at native resolution? Well, now it's only 40 versus 39, so it's a much closer game here, and it's a 1 FPS difference either way in the 1% lows, so this is basically a tie, but still overall frame rates aren't great, so maybe you need to kick on upscaling, in which case now the 4060 is 8% faster and has better image quality. Let's talk image quality a bit here. I think this is a game where you can definitely see it if we freeze frame it on the hair. Also look at the character arm when it's in motion as objects are disoccluded, the amount of breakup and fizzle. It's not perfect on either, but I do think it looks noticeably better on the DLSS image. And I just clicked on the wrong tab. There we go. So if we go to 1440p low settings, we're now getting close to 60 FPS without any kind of upscaling, but I do think it looks noticeably worse than the medium settings. So kind of going to be up to you on whether you want to avoid upscaling entirely or you want to and use the lowest possible settings, or if you want to use better settings with upscaling. Now it's a 4% advantage for the 4060 at 58 versus 56, although the 7600 XT does have the lead in the 1% lows. If we use low settings with upscaling, we can get into 75 versus 65 FPS, 15% advantage for the RTX 4060, and again, I think a bit better image quality. Another Unreal Engine 5 game I tested out here is Hellblade 2: Senua's Saga at 1080p high settings, and high is the highest settings in this game. We're seeing a 7% lead for the 7600 XT at 46 versus 43. This is a very slow-paced game, so that might be good enough frame rates for you, but you might also want to get closer to 60 FPS. In which case, you could go down to medium settings. Now the 4060 is averaging 59, the 7600 XT is averaging 63, which gives it a 7% advantage, although the 1% lows are a larger advantage at 57 versus 48. At 1440p high settings, neither GPU is doing great. 32 versus 30, 7% advantage for the 7600 XT. So if we want to kick on upscaling, that means we can now go up to 49 versus 47 FPS. 4% advantage for the 7600 XT. It looks like I have a typo in the 1% lows. That should be 100%, not 10%. Or actually, no, I think it might be a 10% advantage. Just ignore the 1% lows. You can look up at the actual frame rate counters up in the top of the screen. Sorry on that. I think I mistyped the 40 there, but whatever. The point is, I don't think these are the settings we'd be using exactly here anyway. And so I think going down to medium settings as a baseline makes more sense. Although still here, we're not getting great frame rates. So it's probably going to take going down to medium settings and upscaling to get the frame rates that we're looking for. Here at just medium settings, no upscaling, it's 44 versus 42, 5% lead for the 7600 XT, and 11% lead in the 1% lows. But if we kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, we're now over 60 FPS on both GPUs, so 67 versus 64. So this might be how you'd actually play the game, in which case the performance is pretty close. But once again, I think DLSS looking a little bit sharper. especially as things are uncovered by the character model in motion. Looks a little more fizzly on the FSR image. So again, it's hard to factor things like that numerically. It's like it performing similarly, but looking a bit better on the 4060. Now, if we look at Dragon Age the Veilguard with 1080p Ultra with selective ray tracing enabled, we see a 85% advantage for the 7600 XT at 50 versus 27, going from, playable but not amazing frame rates to awful. Why is this happening with ray tracing enabled? Why is AMD winning so much? It's a VRAM issue again. So spilling over the VRAM on the 4060 means it gets crushed there. If we just go down to Ultra settings without ray tracing enabled, we now see the 7600 XT winning by 6%. And even better in the 1% lows. However, again, we're still not over 60 FPS here, which is a bit annoying. So how about we go to medium settings? At 1080p medium settings, we now see no VRAM issues, and they're mostly timed. It's a 5% lead for the 7600 XT at 84 versus 80. If we go to 1440p, and again wanted to be running at Ultra with selective RT, you'd have to use upscaling to get even sort of reasonable frame rates. We're going 45 versus 40 here. 13% advantage for the 7600 XT despite it being ray tracing, and a 29% lead in the 1% lows. Again, why is the 7600 XT winning in a ray tracing test? Again, because the 4060 is getting bogged down by its 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So if we try Ultra settings with DLSS and FSR quality but no ray tracing, the 7600 XT is still winning by quite a lot because, again, the 8 gigabytes VRAM is not enough. If you go down to medium settings, which is what you need to do to get to around 60 FPS on either GPU, the 7600 XT is now only winning by 11%, still a win though, at 63 versus 57. So again, the settings you use make the advantage for one GPU or the other vary wildly, as it impacts whether or not you're spilling past that 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer. If you use medium settings with DLSS or FSR enabled, which I think on a 1440p display with DLSS is a pretty reasonable way to play this, now the performance difference is basically tied, and I would say that DLSS is delivering a little better image quality. So again, the strengths and weaknesses of the different cards makes this a little bit of a hard call as far as like this one is just flat out better in this game. If we go to Ghost of Tsushima, 1080p very high settings, we're getting a 12% advantage for the 7600 XT at 77 versus 69, a 17% lead in the 1% lows. It doesn't seem like this is a VRAM related issue. It just seems like the 7600 XT is a bit favored in this title. If we drop down to medium settings, you can now get a nice high frame rate experience at 108 versus 94. That's a 15% lead for the 7600 XT. Again, decent lead here, and there doesn't seem to be any indication that it's VRAM related. It's just a title that favors the 7600 XT. If we go up to 1440p very high settings, now the 7600 XT's lead is 8%, but it's 52 versus 48 FPS. I think it would make sense to adjust the settings a little bit. So if we do that, and go ahead and switch down to the very high settings, but with upscaling enabled, so same base settings, but we're lowering the rendering resolution. We're now getting a 4% lead for the 7600 XT, but 72 versus 69, nice. But again, I think you're getting a little better image quality on the DLSS side of the screen. Although honestly, I think this is one of the games with a better than typical FSR implementation. If you look at things like the bird in the distance as it flaps its wings, you'll notice a little more like kind of fizzling disocclusion artifacting from the FSR side of the screen than I think you get on DLSS. So again, similar performance, small win performance-wise for the 7600 XT, but I think a bit of a better image for the DLSS upscale. And those are settings you might use. However, you might just go to medium settings and not use any upscaling, in which case it's 71 FPS versus 64, 11% lead for the 7600 XT. There's no image quality differences because we're not using the upscaling, right? Same settings. What if we move on to Horizon Forbidden West at 1080p very high settings? It's again basically a tie here, 66 versus 65, technically a 2% 1 FPS win for the 4060. And they're both getting around 60 FPS. If you wanted to get a higher refresh rate experience though, you could go down to 1080p medium settings. Now you're getting 91 versus 89. Again, not a big win either way, and the 1% lows swing 7600 XT's advantage, 4060 swings the 4060's advantage, sorry, in the averages, and again, I'd call it a tie. At 1440p very high settings, though, we start to notice some spikes in the frame time graph for the 4060, indicating that in the 1% lows especially, there is a problem with 8 gigabytes of VRAM here, leading to a 28% lead in the 1% lows for the 7600 XT, even though their average frame rates are almost tied at 48 versus 46. If you kick on DLSS or FSR, it does not rein in VRAM enough to stop those spikes in the frame time graph on the 4060, continuing the 23%, about a 23% advantage for the 7600 XT in the 1% lows, and it's just a generally smoother experience. Although the image quality, again, I'd say looks a little better, especially when the hair swings and things like that for DLSS. If we go down to medium settings and don't use upscaling, we're now hitting about 60 FPS on each GPU, 64 versus 62, 3% lead for the 4060, and again, no image quality difference because we're both using the same settings here, and we're not seeing the VRAM issues now that we've gone down to medium settings. If we kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, the 4060 is now coming out 8% ahead at 86 versus 80, and I would say it has better looking image. Again, if you look at things moving quickly, things when things are uncovered by the player character, the hair swinging, things like that, just looks more pixelated in the FSR image and more cohesive and detailed in the DLSS image. In God of War Ragnarok at 1080p Ultra settings, this seems to be not a VRAM-related difference, but just a more of an NVIDIA-favored title. We're seeing the 4060 take a 15% advantage here, 55 versus 48, despite this not being, there's no ray tracing going on or anything like that. Just seems to run better on NVIDIA. At 1080p medium settings, our frame rates are now a lot higher, more like how you might play it, and it's 76 versus 69. Nice, 10% advantage for the 4060, and 15% advantage in the 1% lows. If we go up to 1440p Ultra, performance isn't great overall, 43 versus 39, 10% lead for the 4060, but again, I'd probably choose some other settings. If you kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, the 4060 is now close to a 60 FPS average at 58, giving it a 16% lead over the 7600 XT at 50, and looking better while doing it. The same general kind of disocclusion, fizzle, and things like that advantages. If we go down to 1440p medium settings, now they're all basically tied. 54 FPS and 44 FPS in the 1% lows. But you might still want a bit more performance than that. So what if you kick on upscaling? So medium settings with upscaling, now the 4060 scales ahead again. 15% advantage at 78 versus 68, and it has a bit of an image quality advantage for those same kind of disocclusion artifacting reasons. If we move on to Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, there we go. This is another game where you cannot turn off ray tracing. However, here we're seeing a big lead in the 1% lows for the 7600 XT, indicating that there is potentially some VRAM issues going on with the 4060. However, if we go down to medium settings, now the 4060 is taking a 13% lead at 68 versus 60 and a 10% advantage in the 1% lows. So once again, showing a ray tracing advantage, especially when you are not running out of VRAM. At 1440p Ultra, it seems like the game must just be adjusting its texture cache to stay within the 8 gigabytes here, and we weren't seeing the same issues I saw at 1080p. And at 1440p Ultra with upscaling, the 4060 takes a 10% advantage. But again here, it's 46 FPS versus 42. This isn't really an amazing way to play the game, so I think you'd probably adjust things from here anyway. If you go down to medium settings, it's only 45 versus 41, 10% advantage for the 4060, but still probably not the settings you're looking for, so I think you might have to go to medium with upscaling, in which case it's 68 FPS for the 4060 versus 58 on the 7600 XT, which is a 17% advantage for the 4060. In Cyberpunk at 1080p Ultra with RT Reflections, we're seeing the 4060 take a 27% advantage at 56 versus 44. In this case, I've only turned on RT Reflections because if you try to go any more heavy with the ray tracing, even the 4060 doesn't really do a great job here. And honestly, 56 FPS in this built-in benchmark when a lot of areas in the new Dogtown area and things like that run worse than this, I'm still not convinced this is an amazing experience. 1080p Ultra with no ray tracing, now the 7600 has the advantage by 9% at 85 versus 78 and 67 versus 60 in the 1% lows. So again, are you going to play this at a bit of a lower frame rate with RT Reflections or just turn off ray tracing? Gives you a different experience on which GPU is going to be better. And at 1440p, if we try to go ultra with RT reflections turned on and use upscaling to make it playable, we're now seeing the 4060 hit 61 FPS, giving it a 33% advantage over the 7600 XT. This might be a reasonable setting to use on the RTX 4060, but probably not on the 7600 XT. However, if we go to 1440p Ultra with no ray tracing, now the 7600 XT has an 18% advantage, although it's only hitting 52 FPS versus 44 on the 4060, so still probably not the settings you would use. If you use Ultra settings with DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, now the 7600 XT is 17% faster. It's getting 68 FPS versus 58. However, it's like not necessarily the perfect experience on either GPU. You might want to go down to high settings from here anyway. But the point is, again, you get the DLSS image quality advantage with things like the fence here. It's less stable on the FSR image. You'll see things like that if you look at the palm tree branches in the distance. All of that does look more stable with the DLSS image. By the way, this is the CNN model, not the new Transformer model, as I did the testing between these two GPUs before the game got patched into the new Transformer model for DLSS. If we switch into a competitive title, though, and running at low settings, like Call of Duty Black Ops 6, this is a game where AMD has a big advantage generally, and we're seeing that here as a 23% win for the 7600 XT at 173 versus 141 FPS. If we move up to 1440p basic settings, it's a 22% lead for the 7600 XT at 117 versus 96. However, if we kick on DLSS and FSR quality to try to boost performance a bit more at 1440p basic, we're now seeing only a 10% advantage for the 7600 XT. It is still a win, although I think, again, a little better image quality from the DLSS side of things. And we're at 140 versus 127 here. And that is all of the benchmarks that I ran for this video. It was a lot. If you want the full unedited side-by-sides without me skipping through them and all of that, those have been up on the members feed for a while because I just throw up my side-by-side benchmarks up there as soon as they're ready without any of my commentary or anything like that. It's kind of like an early access thing before the video is actually ready. But again, here's the overall summary. So what is my overall thoughts? Again, I think the fact that there's only a 2% performance differential is a bit misleading as far as trying to give you guidance on what the experience is actually going to be like. It's kind of odd in that, like I said, even if you sort this for ray tracing or no ray tracing, it might not go exactly the way you think, right? So like if we go ray tracing results, and again, remember the positive differential is 7600 XT advantages and the negative differential is 4060 advantage. That's the way to read this chart. Here we're seeing the 4060 is only averaging 5% faster in ray tracing, which might be surprising. Big advantage for NVIDIA. But what it really means is that it's often actually 10 to 50% faster, depending on the ray tracing game, until it runs out of VRAM. And then once it runs out of VRAM, it just absolutely gets crushed, and now you see the 7600 XT much faster, although not necessarily at particularly playable frame rates, right? And also, a bunch of these ray tracing results are involving DLSS to try to get playable frame rates, in which case the image quality looks better on the NVIDIA GPU. So this all is kind of complicated. Now, if you're just like, I don't care about ray tracing, well, remember there are some games that do require it. Like just out of the ones I tested here, Indiana Jones and Avatar both require ray tracing, and there are more games coming out where that is the case. But if you're just like, I just don't care, we can look at the no ray tracing results. If I filter out the ray tracing results, my 7600 XT is only coming out about 5% faster overall, but you can see some games where it is significantly faster, again, where the 4060 is running out of VRAM. However, there are games where the NVIDIA GPU is just faster. Certain titles, like out of the test suite I did here, God of War Ragnarok and Silent Hill 2, seem to just particularly favor the NVIDIA card here, whereas other titles like Call of Duty, Final Fantasy, things like that, seem to favor the AMD card. So what am I trying to make out of all of this? I mean, if you're gonna buy a GPU right now, it's really hard to recommend anything, if I'm being 100% honest. Again, we're at about $300 for a 4060. Doesn't feel great on an 8 gigabyte GPU, but is the 7600 XT really justifying the extra $30. Like I said, it's not 12% faster, but it costs 12% more. But in the games where the VRAM's an issue, it can be more than 12% faster, right? But I think at this performance level, especially if you're trying to play on a 1440p display where you're more likely to run out of VRAM, you're also more likely to be turning down graphic settings and using upscaling, in which case you're then maybe gonna stay within it. So I wish I could give you guys some kind of hard and fast, this is the GPU you should buy out of this video. But instead, I've given you a whole bunch of information, and you need to think about which of these situations are more likely to represent what you will be doing with the GPU. For example, if you actually look at the most popular games people are playing, like top 10 games on Steam, the vast majority of them are older esports or live service titles, which are honestly going to run pretty well on both of these GPUs and aren't likely to go over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So if that's more of the type of thing that you're playing, you might save the money, go with the 8 gigabyte card there. Whereas if you're playing some of the latest graphically demanding games, you're more likely to go over the 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but you're also more likely to need upscaling to enable the highest end graphic settings. So I guess what I've got to say here is I'm not a huge fan of either of these GPUs, but think about which one you prefer. If the 7600 XT cost less, I think I'd have a bit more of a reason to recommend it. But I'm not sure I can recommend spending noticeably more than the 4060 to have a kind of hit or miss win in certain situations kind of a thing. Anyway, that's where I'm at. I've got a lot of information for you, but I'm not sure I have an answer on which one of these you should buy. You can always wait for the next generation. Maybe the 5060 will be good, but a lot of rumors point to it maybe being an 8 gigabyte card again, and given the pricing of the 50 series so far, especially in the actual retail market with supply, we'll have to see if it offers much of a meaningful upgrade over the 4060. I hope there's some movement there. But for now, this is kind of where we're at. And if you're like, what about the Intel B580? The B580 is not available at a reasonable price right now. That's why I'm not talking about that. Anyway, I hope all of you found this useful and or interesting, and have an excellent day.